Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode of Dis Affamie History Podcast, host Wendy Aris explores the documentary German Town, the lost story of Seaford Town, Jamaica, directed and produced by David Ritter. This powerful film uncovers the hidden history of Seaford Town, a small community in Westmoreland, founded by German indentured settlers in the 1830s after emancipation. Through their story, we gain a deeper understanding of migration, cultural identity, and heritage in the Caribbean. The episode examines how Seaford Town's German Jamaican descendants preserve traditions, navigate identity, and face the challenges of memory and recognition in today's Jamaica. This conversation highlights the resilience of Caribbean communities and the ways diverse histories, African, European, and Creole, intertwine to shape identity across generations. If you're passionate about Caribbean history, cultural heritage, or untold migration stories, this episode offers a unique and eye-opening perspective. Tune in as we bring Seaford Town's forgotten story into the light.
So I just wanted to thank you so much, David Ritter, for coming on to the podcast, Dis Affamie History, and to speak about your documentary, Germantown, what you had done. And I had seen the documentary. Very, very, very fascinating, and very much so aligning with stories that aren't really discussed or told. But before we start, I'll just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself, and then we'll start with the episode.
All right. Thank you, Wendy. Thanks for having me on. I'm a documentarian and filmmaker, something I just started doing when I was in my early 20s. I started as an art student at the SMFA in Boston, and I took an interest in still photography, which led to an interest in video. And I wasn't into artsy avant-garde things. Sometimes that can be interesting, but I wasn't part of that crowd. I wasn't. I was really just whenever I present my photographs and things. I remember my photography teacher, an amazing photographer named Bill Burke. He said to me once, you're not really much of an artist, and I was taking offense, and I was getting very cross, and I was like, no, what I mean is maybe you should be doing photojournalism. You seem like more of a journalist, documenting things more than that. And I felt I was very vexed about it because I thought he was degrading me. But I realized, no, he wasn't. He was trying to steer me in a better direction. And I just don't know. I always took an interest in seeing places, people, and things that I find of value, interesting, beautiful, whatever it might be, and just capturing it. And eventually that went into video and all the possibilities that come from still photography to video and now having audio. And I moved back into the West Indies after I finished my education, and I was living in Jamaica. Eventually went back and I went into Haiti for a while. And whenever I go stateside, all my mates and everyone abroad would always ask questions and have all these numerous questions. I thought, well, I should be documenting so many things. And there's so many interesting things that I guess I wanted to talk about that existed outside the cliche things. What reggae music, everyone talks about that. Voodoo religion, I mean, that's this thing everyone takes fascination. But I think there's so many other things. And one thing that always came up is well, but you're white. You're living in these black countries. That's strange. That doesn't make sense. That was a mindset a lot of people have outside of the Caribbean. Kind of can even exist within those countries. You can find this, well, white people don't belong here, or you would have these. It was a very interesting thing. And one thing that was striking is I remember in Kingston, Jamaica, I was I was getting a ride from Father Ho Lung, the missionaries of the poor. I'm acquainted with them.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them, yeah, I did volunteer work for them briefly, and some of them saw me walking down the street. I got a ride, and I was in the back of this truck with these Americans that were visiting, and they thought it was bizarre that I was a white person walking down the street in Kingston. And they said something about how you can't walk around here, kid. What, you got to get off the tourist resort or something? You know, you can't be in it. Thought they told me that I was going to get chopped up or murdered because I'm white. Or I said, then, you know, pray tell, sir, how do you think white Jamaicans survive if everyone here is out to murder them? And he said, oh, white Jamaicans, that's ridiculous. Well, around that same time, a few minutes later, they stopped to meet with a benefactor. I don't know if I should say who. We'll say someone who has a family who has a big resort. We'll say in Jamaica, so that narrows it down.
Yeah.
But they're white, and we came in for a visit, and they fed everyone coffee and bread pudding. And these people were shocked. They were asking, "So where are you all from?" And they said, "We're Jamaican." Well, where are you originally from? Jamaica. Well, where are your parents? Jamaica. And their jaws dropped, and I felt this vindication. I was kind of looking over that you just it's just an interesting experience of that shock and ignorance. So it led me on a path starting around maybe approximately 2006 onward of documenting ethnic racial minorities within the Caribbean, which extended onward into other parts of the world where I've done Christian minorities in Iraq and Armenian and Assyrian communities in the Middle East. And now I've been working with minorities in Africa, South Africa right now. And so it's led me on a path of just talking about the history and stories of people from small ethnic enclaves and groups throughout the world. I guess it's kind of led me on that.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. It's just to know what everyone's path is, and then, of course, then I guess going into it, like then what inspired you, then of course for making this documentary on Germantown in Jamaica.
Oh, like I said, after that experience with those, we'll call them missionaries or visitors, tourists, and having numerous experiences where everyone would just see you as a freak show. If you're white and foreigners, like Americans, would find white people, they're always shocked. Well, this isn't possible. What are you doing here? Well, and I think it's also, I talked to a sociologist about this from Boston University, and he explained to me that this is a common thing. People build up perceptions in their mind. And when you break it, it creates this mental shake. And they end up becoming hostile with you because you just made their life more difficult. Now they have to reevaluate things and create more of a complexity and nuance of a certain thing that they prepared their psyche for. So I realized, that was something I really wanted to do, is shake people's perceptions and challenge them. And living as a minority in these predominantly black places, is that I wanted to share my experience vicariously through that of others, and all of the questions and things. I guess it was almost like a therapeutic session, cathartic in some sense, right?
Yeah.
And it started in Haiti, where I did a whole documentary on Haitian minorities, and I was focusing on Haitians of French and German descent who are still, families who are still in Haiti. And people of whatever, be it Italian or Lebanese, Middle Eastern descent. So not all Haitians are of African descent. There are a small minority that still remain. And I wanted to give that history and that story and who those people were. And I found the rare occasions when it is talked about is very polarized. It's always class. It's based on, these are the rich people that are a detriment to everyone. It's just very polarized views. I wanted to humanize it and show it's beyond. Haitians of European or Caucasian background aren't purely a class structure. They're individuals, human beings, and they come from numerous backgrounds. Some of them are very rich in what they call the elite. Some are from more middle class and working class backgrounds, and some of them are, I would agree, I've experienced in that demographic, some who are very Machiavellian, very manipulating the politics of the country in those echelons. Others are just normal people who want to run a business or live their lives and have a job and run a shop. And I found to be very normal individuals, right? Just kind people. They run the gamut, really, like any demographic of people. And Same in Jamaica. So I continued that into Jamaica, and being of German ancestry, I just took an interest in Seaford Town. And one book that really inspired me is from a great writer named Ricardo Arizio, who wrote about, it's called Lost White Tribes. It's a documentation of numerous European enclaves of people just embedded into other countries. Whether it's the Dutch, who you'll find throughout Asia in small little communities, and going out through Africa, he finds small villages of Dutch or European and German descendants living in the deserts and places of different regions who had been embedded there for generations. And I thought, well, why don't I do something similar? And Seaford Town was mentioned in the book. And he wrote that in the 1990s. And here I was. It was over 15, almost 20 years later. And there was, at the time, almost nothing circulating in the medium of video or film on Seaford Town. I know that the TVJ on Hill and Gully did have a piece, and I watched it, but it never was, at the time, broadcasted outside of Jamaica. It had been on TVJ several times. I know that the days of the JBC, I think there was one brief piece on Seaford Town in the 70s or 80s, but from that point on, there was very little the world had. So I saw there's a great opportunity to be able for me to document it, make an actual video documentary. And at the time period when I released it in 2012, I think it's fair to say I was the only one who had a documentary on Seaford Town, at least to the general public worldwide, which was a great thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And would you be able to, let's go into the history behind the arrival of Germans in Jamaica and how Germantown was established?
Well, okay, again, this gets contentious and people argue over this, even in the academic realm, but we're going back to the 1830s, and we're going back to the emancipation period in Jamaica, where the slavery was now being ended. The abolitionist movement had succeeded, and the Crown had now deemed slavery to be illegal, and they were giving the planters, approximately was a 5-year period or an 8-year period, where they had to incrementally now liberate the slave population. And at this point, the planters were, I think, kind of frantic, scrambling for alternatives to maintain a cheap forms of labor. So they looked into indentured servitude. This is where it gets contentious, because there's numerous academics who insist the German arrivals never did any form of agricultural indentureship. I've even had people insist they weren't indentured. I dealt with some who would, where they come up with this, they never could give me an actual answer or any documentation. They would just make assertions and use games of semantics. But according to numerous academics and historians and publications, the Germans in the 1830s were coming under stipulations of indentureship to work as indentured laborers under these plantation systems. It started with an individual, I believe, named Solomon Myers. Now, Solomon Myers was a Jamaican planter. I don't believe he was from Jamaica originally. He was of a German Jewish derivation. I tend to wonder if that Myers rum is correlated to him. May or may not be, but he was a sugarcane planter, and he worked with another German agent that was residing in Jamaica named William Lamonius. So what we now gather is that there were some numbers of people of German origin in Jamaica already. This goes back from documentation I've seen going back as far as the 1700s. Now, most of these men, and it was very small numbers at this point, from what I understand, there wasn't any quote unquote German community or any flourishing area. I don't know if there was necessarily German neighborhoods in Montego Bay or anything. I don't know what the numbers were, but it seems to be very small numbers of Germans. And I think from what I've read, they were generally coming under as craftsmen working in the shipping industry. Montego Bay and Port Royal were now booming places, and they needed shipbuilders and people who could repair sails, and carpenters and masons and so on and so forth. So you had some men who came as skilled labor and built some very good fortunes for themselves. Most would stay for finite periods of time and leave. Some looked like they embedded themselves into Jamaican society, into British society. And that seems to be where the majority were. Some seem to got into planting as well as plantation owners in the case of Solomon Myers. And at this time, he was working with an individual who was originally from Prussia, I believe Dr. William Lemonius, and became an agent working for Solomon Myers, who created a kind of a campaign, a propaganda program to try to coerce impoverished Germans over to Jamaica for labor that they required. Now, I think one of the main purposes is that they wanted to create multiple things were going on. The white population was after emancipation was decreasing rapidly in Jamaica. Many people were leaving the country due to fear of violence, upheaval, racial violence, maybe even a civil war environment, I'm assuming. And so people were seeing this as a potentially dangerous situation, and people were leaving, and they didn't know. And the white population was already a minority in Jamaica at this point. The transatlantic slave trade had outnumbered the European population. So the government, the local council, wanted to bolster the white population. So they were looking towards indentured servants and labor from Europe. And they were also looking to Asia as well. They were getting Chinese indentured labor eventually. Indians were becoming very common. They were using a lot of Indian indentured labor to work the plantation systems to substitute that labor. I've seen many assertions that the Germans were doing agricultural labor. Many people contest that. Nonetheless, where they were coming in as, many of them were, again, craftsmen and professionals. They were masons and carpenters, and they were blacksmiths in some cases, dressmakers, bakers, so on. Many of the women, is well documented, were working in domestic labor. Many were career soldiers as well. That was interesting. They were recruiting many former military. And one purpose of these German townships seemed to be a buffer zone that they were trying to create to deflect potential raids on plantations. They had several situations that I think that already existed, where planters were killed or the overseers were being killed. And there was also some raids on plantations. People would go for supplies. And I think it's also evident that this is not far from some of the maroon townships in Westmoreland, where Seaford Town was located. They may have been worried about the maroon townships raiding them, perhaps. But nonetheless, these townships worked as a buffer zone. So if anyone was to try to raid the plantation, they would first have to basically trespass on multiple properties. Now, these villages, these German townships, especially in the case of Seaford Town, were cut from the thicket by these Germans themselves. These were swamps. These were lands that were uncultivated, and they built it from hand. The houses, the farms, everything on them. That was a major part of their labor, was building these villages. And I believe it was close to half of the first of the arrivals, about 1,500 to 2,000 people in the first wave. About half of them died within the first 5 years. Diseases took them out: malaria, yellow fever. And then another wave, I believe, came in the early 1840s. So you had 3 waves, I believe. The majority of these people, many died. It was massive death rate. And when people were pairing from their indentureship, many people were selling their properties or taking any money they had and trying to leave and go elsewhere, be that South Central America, North America, or back to Europe if they could. It becomes a very difficult way to get back on that kind of voyage. So it seems like quite a few families did make their way to the United States and to larger German communities that were existing there. But that was the origin of it. From that point on, these villages, most of them have died out. There you can go throughout Trelawney, St. Thomas, and various places, and you can still find villages to this day. Then you can find Hanover and German names to various villages. Seaford Town, not a German name, that was from Baron Seaford, the landowner that granted that portion of his property to those German arrivals. So that's why it has the name Seaford Town. But you'll find various villages to this day in Trelawney as well with German names, Brownstown, and you can find places like Hanover. So a lot of these villages have died out completely. Some of those villages founded. And some of those villages still have some German cultural retention to this day. But Seaford Town had the highest level of genealogical and cultural German retention. One would argue, I would argue, to this very day. If you go there, you'll still find German designed gingerbread homes. You'll find numerous family names like Hacker, and you'll find Graskopf, and you'll find names like Kamika, which I believe could be of a Polish derivation, but you'll find German names, even given names have lived on. People have have names like Hans, and that have lived on some given names. And it's striking. If you were in Seaford Town in the 1980s or 90s, the majority of people were white. They were primarily or even fully of their German lineage, blonde hair, blue eyes. That has become a minority now. When I was filming, I believe there was approximately 1,500 people in Seaford Town. I don't think it's much bigger, maybe 1,500 to 2,000 people in the village. I would reckon that maybe people who are fully of that German lineage or white people are probably maybe 150 at the time. So definitely a minority, but many people, those families have mixed in. So there's lots of people of mixed derivation who are half of the German lineage. Some people of Chinese descent and Indian descent, but they also have a German lineage as well. So it's become over time, a lot of the German families have migrated out and left and been dying out. And now a lot of those houses are being bought by just Jamaicans from other areas. So like anywhere in Jamaica, it is a black majority village, but still has a high demographic of people of German ancestry. And, it's quite striking. You'll find a white man with a machete in hand, working in his field, and you'll talk to him, speaks patois, speaks Jamaican Creole like anyone else, but he has the name Hans Graskopf or something like that, and blonde hair, blue-eyed individual, and you'll find that. So it's in that sense, it's a striking place, and there are attributes of German culture living on to this day in various ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, how would you say that these settlers, I guess, integrated, gave a little bit of that, while still maintaining aspects of their German identity?
I don't really see how much of that was actually conscious versus just things that happen over time. It seems that people, were really focused on survival. The language seemed to die out rapidly. So by the early 20th century, it doesn't seem like there were many, if any, German people speaking German at that point. English and Jamaican Creole was the predominant tongue. And then, I feel like the aspects of German architecture were just being passed on. It wasn't conscious. I always ask people, why do you build your homes this way? Or why do you keep your house like this? And they would tell me, this is the way my grandfather built things. It's the way my father built things. It's the way I do it. So it's just kind of a utilitarian in that regard, I think. I've had lots of different assertions from people in the village and elsewhere about the language, as far as did
Yes.
any German language live on. There's people who would tell me that they remember people saying things like Dankeschön or Dank, growing up. Other people say, oh, no, that's not true. The language is completely dead. I don't know. I wasn't around in the 50s and 60s, so I couldn't really tell you.
Yeah.
I did meet a Seaford Town musician who was playing German folk songs still. And I asked him, well, where did you get these? And he said, well, when they opened an educational program, the German government, being this is a village of German origin, did help fund a technical school. And that technical school also had a kindergarten that one of the teachers, his wife, ran a kindergarten program. So there was some revival in German culture around the 1960s and 70s. And she taught the children these folk songs. So people still have that aspect. You might find some folk songs living on with a few people. The roast pork, I believe it's from the Gardner family. I'm trying to remember someone there making a traditional Seaford Town roast pork that has German roots to it. It's a roast pig. I believe Germans would usually stuff it with, say, oats and barley, but he does peas and rice. So it's a Jamaican take on an old German thing. And actually, bratwurst was living on in that village well into probably the 1980s, 1990s. I talked to many people, and they said, "Oh yeah, my grandmother would make sauerkraut and bratwurst all the time. And they call it they just call it Wurst, which is
Mhm.
the German word for sausage. The last man who could make that died in the late 90s, early 2000s. I never met him, but that
Mhm.
was something that lived on well into the modern era as well. And I've talked to people that remember growing up eating some German things like that. The Catholic faith it was a Catholic majority village. Still, many of the Germans who came, there was a large portion of them were Catholics. So the Catholic faith is an aspect. Um, and a lot of the people in Seaford Town, the German families, are very proud of their skills as craftsmen,
Yes.
mechanics, engineers, builders, carpenters, masons. They're very proud of those skills, and they assert that those skills are passed down from their family. And I think all of them agree that it's part of their German heritage.
Mhm.
That and people would seek out the people of Seaford Town. Some still do, to find them to do mason work. If you need a great builder, a great carpenter, Seaford Town has a lot of great people like that in those fields. I've met some amazing mechanics and people who are just great tinkerers. They could break apart electronics and fix it for you in moments, and anything mechanical they were very inclined in fixing. So that's something that they feel. I would say that a lot of the
Yeah.
people feel is an aspect of their German culture that lives on to this day. Um, but I think the retaining those cultural attributes was more of not conscious, but just something that lived on as utilitarian. As far as I asked other people, were people consciously trying to keep a German descended village?
Yeah.
And a lot of people feel yes, that they did see themselves as different growing up in the old days. They wanted to be a part of a German bloodline. They felt that they were unique and they stayed
Yeah.
together. And it remained a predominantly German descended village well up into the 1990s. It's only very recent that it's dwindled dramatically
Mhm.
to where there's not a lot of people left of that descent. They're all, to be fair, there's a lot of mixed people of that descent. You'll
Yes.
find someone who's black but has a German last name. They might even have some physical attribute, blonde hair or blue or green eyes. Um, and I've met people who are black and still profess the title. They'll say, "I'm German." They'll even have that
Yes.
title. When they say German from Seaford Town, that's one word you always say. You can talk to my brother; he can tell you some history. He's a German. I
Yeah.
remember catching a bus to Seaford Town. I hailed down the bus and I said, "Seaford Town," and the driver said, "Yes, man." And one of the other one of the drivers, he laughed. He said, "I told you he's a German. He's one of them Germans." So they thought I was from the Seaford Town German clan. I'm of German ancestry, so I won't deny it. Then
Yeah.
Um, so there was a sense of an enclave, a clan they've had, and I think some people still have that sense of a family kind of connection. That was something we did discuss in the documentary. It was a difficult topic, is that the people were intermarrying into family cousins,
Mhm.
and that was going on for generations, and it caused a lot of birth defects. You can find people in Seaford Town who are blind, who are deaf, who are mute, and a lot of people feel that that was from too much of the intermixing, because eventually over time there wasn't a large enough group of people that there was you, if you intermarry to another person of German descent, over a couple generations, it just
Yeah.
turned into marrying cousins. And so that has been something that's is very uncommon now. They're not
Mhm.
marrying into similar families of German descent now. People are marrying out. They're marrying into people of African descent and Asian descent and so on. So um, and like I said, migration has been a big thing for everyone in Jamaica, going
Mhm.
to Canada or the United States or anywhere else for a better living. And so that's also affected the village and its German heritage. People have migrated out rapidly in the past, we'll say 50 years, right?
Yeah.
Maybe or so, since the 1960s.
Mhm. No, definitely. No, thank you for that. And and I guess, further going on that, how do the descendants of the original settlers see themselves today? Do they mostly see themselves as German, Jamaican, or both?
I feel that most everyone I spoke to in Seaford Town um, see themselves as Jamaicans first and foremost.
Mhm.
Very, very proud Yardies. That's how they see themselves. Uh, I did find a demographic, and some of them were white, even primarily or fully of German descent, and they almost were hostile if I talked about the heritage and culture. They got very cross and angry. I'm a Jamaican, they would say. I'm well aware you're a Jamaican. I never said you weren't. And they wouldn't want to talk about their German heritage because they felt that I'm almost ostracized from it. They felt either anger or shame or disgust, or they wouldn't want to be acknowledged as someone who's of German descent. They just wanted to be seen as Jamaican, and it bothered them. Well, I talked to some other individuals, and they were very fiercely proud of their German roots, and they did see themselves as, again, that colloquial term, they would maybe call themselves, or they were called by even other Jamaicans, a German. Not meaning they're from Germany, or they're meaning they're a Jamaican of that clan, that lineage. Some of them were very proud of it. Delroy Haka, who was in my documentary, was someone who had a very deep sense of pride and love in his German roots. He even had remnants from the original arrivals and ships and antiquities he kept in his home that he cherished. There were almost these relics that he felt connected to. And when I talked to Delroy about how you grew up in a place where almost everyone here was of German descent, and now it's becoming so rare, you very much sense regret and sadness that, you know, he almost felt left behind, and he lost all of his friends and family, is how I guess in the sense he felt. Very an isolated sense. So it was a very heartening experience to see that. So, but even Delroy saw himself very much as Jamaican first and foremost. He didn't, even though he had a love for his German roots, it didn't take away the fact that he was first and foremost a Jamaican. One of the first soldiers in the Jamaican Defense Force when the Jamaican independent military had first been formed. He was one of the first soldiers in it in the 1960s. So these were still very patriotic Jamaicans, and everyone I met, I never saw anyone who said, "Oh, all my allegiance is to Germany or German people." It was, and I guess that is a sense that you can have a balance of having a great sense of pride in your heritage, but still be a patriot to your nation state. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, now does it? You can still be a Jamaican patriot, but still love your heritage. You can be a proud American, still love your heritage. You can be a proud Canadian, still love your family's ancestry. So I think that's how a lot of the people I interviewed saw things. You know what I mean?
No, definitely. And then what role, because I know we talked about this before we started recording, what role does oral history play in preserving, of course, memory of this community?
Oh, I think it was interesting that so many people had these family passed down histories that varied. And some of those histories were, you know, tales of, you know, being descended of princes and kings and queens hiding from some uprising or turmoil in Germany, and they ran to Jamaica to hide in the thicket and in the bush country, and that's how they're there, you know, which, you know, is not necessarily, not really the true history, but definitely oral histories. And then others were just my family were soldiers that were fleeing and deserting the German military, and was something, and they were hiding. And but I found that even though this is what people were being told, these tall tales by their aunts and uncles, their mothers and fathers, their grandparents at bedtime, these things being passed down, these did have grains of truth in them. There were kernels of truth, because a lot of the people were soldiers. That is a true statement. Another true statement is that Germany was in a lot of turmoil. There was a lot of political turmoil. A lot of people were fleeing a very difficult situation, economic turmoil and political turmoil. Germany was going through upheaval at that point. There was a rise of neoliberalism and a want to create a unified Germany, which it was not unified in the 1830s. It was fractured nation states overseen by monarchs generally, and a lot of people wanted to have more of a pan-German unification with maybe a constitutional republic, things of that nature, which the first uprising was crushed. So and a lot of, you know, German military and nation states were fracturing, and it was turning into a lot of these neoliberal uprisings were being suppressed with military force and violence. So it was a tumultuous time period. That continued into the 1870s until finally there was a united Germany. That was the first beginning of the Federal Republic of Germany, a united Germany. So there were several of these uprisings going on. So there is truth to these oral histories. There were people, they were running away. They were fleeing some issues, political issues. They were primarily soldiers. I can't attest that any of them were princes or kings, but there's some truth to them.
Oh, no, no, absolutely. And, was there any particular story for you that was either powerful or really personal that was captured in the documentary?
I always felt that just talking to people about the world that they knew, which was very much a kind of a homogeneous kind of environment of just people of their own lineage. And as those elderly folk who were left, they stubborn and refused to leave, and the world around them changed so rapidly. And here they were on their lonesome, and their sons and daughters and everyone had either left the country or died. Most of their family would die of any given ailment you can think of, and many other people just packing their bags and saying, I want a better life. Whether they moved to Kingston or they moved more often to Canada or migrated away, that was very how people felt. I guess they left alone, living in the past and nostalgia in this place. I found it, that was touching. I remember a very poignant part of the documentary that I am. It's poignant. I'm glad it's in it, but people obsess over it. If you look at the reaction from people, is that we interviewed a woman who was at the time of the interview 95 years old, and mind you, the interview was done in 2011, so thus meaning she was essentially from the 19th century, raised by parents from the 1800s, and she expressed that whites and blacks shouldn't marry and have children together. And this visceral response that comes from people, they go into a rage. The woman was born essentially in the 1800s. She was at 95 years old when I interviewed her, and people are losing their minds over it. But that was, a poignant thing that, there was in Jamaica, there were people who didn't believe in race mixing. Surprise. That wasn't something that was, even in Bob Marley is a perfect example. His father, Norval Marley, had a lot of distance. And I remember an interview with Bob Marley's mother saying that she mentioned that it was a controversial thing at that time period, having a son from a white father. It wasn't accepted by everyone. This is a very hard pill to swallow, because everyone has this narrative that Jamaica was always this multicultural mode society that's colorblind. That's not the truth. So even Bob Marley had struggles. It's well documented. He spoke of it growing up mixed race. He did have issues he dealt with from that. Not that mixed race people weren't common in Jamaica prior to the middle of the 20th century, but people intermarrying, there was controversy from it. And so Seaford Town was a part of that dichotomy in that kind of world where a lot of them didn't believe that was appropriate. And there's many people in Jamaica historically that did not believe that, black and white. And many Jamaican Chinese believed they needed to stay amongst the Chinese historically. That's not as common in this day and age. That's much less common, especially amongst Jamaicans of European descent. I don't. But that is something that did exist. And I documented how there are still people in Jamaica who have that mindset, that have that philosophy. That is something that created a lot of controversy. And I'm always like, can people take into context that this woman was nearly 100 years old? Why are you so angry that someone who's nearly from the 19th century had an idea that reflects the 19th century? Shocker, I guess. But that's something that seemed very poignant, and I wish people didn't obsess about it so much that it makes it the pinnacle of the documentary. And I noticed that most people don't get past that portion. They don't get past the funny pages of the newspaper. They kind of stop there and they have a tantrum, or they judge everyone in Seaford Town with that brush or something, which is absurd. The people of Seaford Town have varying views as individuals, as any community does. Some people saw nothing wrong with intermarrying. In fact, most at this point, younger generations have married into African and Asian. Indian, Chinese, black families. That's very common now, and so.
Exactly. It was just the mindset of that time, and for what she was still kind of projecting. And what would you say, I guess, are some of the challenges that Germantown face in preserving its history and of course its heritage?
I think there's a lot of people in the village who would like to see the history and the culture, heritage, and history maintained and preserved.
Yeah.
There hasn't been, I've seen, any leadership for a long time. There was a man named Father Francis, a priest, that was very much kind of the patriarch of the village for a long time. He had been
Mhm.
stationed there for decades, and he was doing a lot to preserve the German heritage. He taught classes, he documented a lot of history. From what I was told is that Father Francis did have a history degree, as many priests do. It's part of the
Mhm.
seminary. And Father Francis was a great leader to them. But when he passed away, that kind of leadership was gone, and a lot of there was in the village, and I have met some of the descendants and some of the people from who moved to Canada. There's been some great archivists and genealogists outside of it, but within the village, there has been very little to preserve that heritage in a very organized academic way. There was a museum when I was in the village, as you saw, that there was a museum that was being maintained. That
Yeah.
museum, I I don't want to speak out of place, because it was gone for the longest period of time. It was completely shut down. I don't think it's been reestablished. I
Yeah.
may be wrong, but I do
Mhm.
not think it's been reestablished. And things were in the museum weren't being preserved well enough. There was termites eating apart wooden artifacts, because there had been a lot of antiquity and things that people were holding that they put in this museum from their German ancestry. And I think a really good museum would be a good thing for the people again, if they had a museum that could
Yes.
instill some sense of pride and interest in that heritage again. Um, I don't, where that leadership should come from. I think ultimately should be from the people of the village.
Yeah.
Perhaps I don't. As far as I know, there was no program in their local school highlighting German history or heritage. I could suggest that could be a good thing for the children to get versed in the history in that regard. The priests in the church have been fluctuating in and out. I don't know if there was a priest of Polish descent that was there for several years.
Mm.
Um, I I've talked to people. He said he was very uninterested in any aspect of the German heritage, at least from people I spoke to. I reached out to him. He wouldn't even speak to me. So I don't really know. He's gone now, as far as I know. So it's been a revolving door of priests, and there hasn't been anyone, as far as I know, like Father Kemple or Father Francis, who were the priests who did do a lot to preserve some aspects of the history. I find a lot of people don't want them to have that heritage or history. I find there's a lot of people who kind of seem fixed on letting it die out. I've actually been told that by some people, that it should die out and that whole heritage should just diminish and die. Why? And when I would
Mhm.
pose the question, but do you support African history and heritage being maintained in Jamaica? Oh, absolutely. But why not this? And then I would have some sort of thing like, oh, well, they come from a very bad mindset, or they would say something that pertained to German heritage being evil. I actually had a meeting with a woman who runs a Jamaican production company, and it was very brief. I thought it would be a cordial meeting, and she then asked me, "Well, why am I so interested in the village?" And I said, I quoted Marcus Garvey, as we did earlier.
Yeah.
A tree without its roots cannot survive. And she said, those aren't roots we need to embrace. And she then turned the conversation into World War II and Nazis, and I said, this is
Mm.
asinine.
Yeah.
She seemed to have this bias against German heritage, I guess. So I could do the same thing to any culture. I could find bad time periods and leaders,
Exactly.
and say, well, look, Mao Zedong, should Chinese people hate their Chinese heritage?
Yeah.
African Shaka Zulu. A lot of people actually revere Shaka Zulu as a great leader, but he was also brutal, enslaved, murdered numerous people. The Zulu kingdom was fractured and had lots of leaders who were very violent, committed acts of brutality. Should all Africans now hate their African heritage? This is just it's asinine, and anyone I think with at least 3 brain cells to rub together can figure out that you don't stigmatize an entire heritage because of a bad time period.
Yeah.
But that is kind of the case I run into when we're talking about German heritage.
Yeah, I can definitely manage. And I know your documentary talked about, or at least shed light on this particular aspect of, because I think there was an individual that was interviewed. So the younger generation, of course, engaging with their ancestry and cultural identity. And I think it was a question of how they could be able to continue that engagement.
The young man who had the flag in his room, yes. Sadly, I cannot say his name or anything. His family forbid any information about them coming out. So, but a wonderful, brilliant, genius young man who I'll say has gone very far in life. And in many aspects, he's a fully grown man now, that's for sure, because I shot this back and released it in 2012, right?
Yes.
But he became very successful. Very brilliant young man. And I remember, as we discussed, I was interviewing his family members, and I said, well, why is it that you seem like you all, every time I asked a question about German heritage, I would always hit a stone wall. And I said, is it that you just reject your German heritage? You don't embrace it? And then he laughed and said, no, I completely embrace it. And I went to his room, and there was a German flag hanging right in his room. Not a modern German flag of the modern republic, but he felt a kinship, a connection to that. And we talked about his favorite football team. And to be fair, most people love Germany now. They've done so well in football, so German has a lot of support. But even prior to them going, he loved Germany. He said he always supports Germany as a football team, and he said, there's not a lot left that we can identify that's German, but whatever there is, he said, I feel pride in it the same way anyone does. It wasn't some obsessive, racialistic, Eurocentric mindset. It was just, yeah, I feel proud of German heritage on some level. And I think that just lives on for people. We all have that innate in us. There's a lot of people who think it's wrong to do that. We're being told now that I feel there's a lot of what do I describe? Hyperized multiculturalism. And it's back to it's a very politicized mindset. It's either people go into ethno nationalism and go extreme with it, or we're told no, you should have no sense of racial identity. You should just kind of meld into the modern world or something. Those, again, two extreme ends of the spectrum. Why does it have to be a zero-sum game? Can't you still have a sense of cultural pride and identity and still be able to assimilate to whatever said place you live? I think it's able to be balanced. I would like to believe it can be balanced. So.
No, definitely. And so, with all of this, do you feel that there might be a risk of the community's story being forgotten, and what can be done to prevent it?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point there's been great documentation that does exist, that is circulating. I don't think it's not a lot. It's and to be fair, we're talking about a very small little microcosm when we talk about Seaford Town, one village. But the German heritage in Jamaica does extend beyond that village, to be fair. I was simply focusing on that village. Actually, initially, I wanted to document German heritage throughout Jamaica on a much larger scale. But I was one man and very little money at the time. And so that's where I ended up. And that's where it began and ended, sadly. But I do believe that, it definitely is something that's fading, at least in the contemporary era. Something, if you go to that village, you see less and less of it. A lot of those old German homes have been dismantled. People have replaced them with new modern homes, and a lot of them are remained abandoned as well. There's many of them that are now just deteriorating greatly. That's a shame. I think those homes should be preserved. I think, I mean, yeah, whose responsibility is it? I think first and foremost the communities, but that requires leadership, and there needs to be someone to take initiative, be that from the diaspora living in Canada or the US, or be that people still in the village. Delray Hawker was one of those people. He kind of tried to. Rosemary Kamika was a woman who's done a lot to try to, and I don't mean to condemn the people of Seaford Town, like no one's tried. I think they have very limited resources and funds. As you've seen, it's an impoverished village, as many Jamaican villages are impoverished. I guess I don't mean to drag you into my controversy and my, I'm a fire starter. I stir the pot, but I will say this. There's no reason for this lack of resource in Jamaica, be it on whether it's museums, education, be they rural communities or be they urban communities. Jamaica is seeing a boom right now, more so than in my lifetime. There is a lot of money moving around, primarily from subsidies from China, which that's a whole other digression I don't want to get into. But there is a lot more money happening. Regardless, I feel that the ball has been dropped. Now, I'm not a socialist. I think people should do things from their own volition and their own accord. I don't wish to promote any political policy, but I can say is that the people of Jamaica have been neglected for a very long time. Education has been neglected. Educational resources, like in the rural communities especially, have been neglected. And it's due to corruption, period. It's corrupt, and it's due to very bad leadership. And you can blame a lot of people. People like to point fingers at the private sector and say it's the private sector's fault or it's the government's fault. There's a lot of people, I think, to blame, but it needs to stop. And I think, yes, definitely museums, educational resources. And I think people need to get out of the poverty they've been in for so long. And part of that is their own responsibility, most definitely. We all take part in our outcome. But Jamaica has seen some very bad impoverished situations and lack of resources. And I think institutions need to take initiative. Absolutely. They need to be called out. I know I've embarrassed a lot of people by making the documentary. One thing I will say that I was in Los Angeles doing a presentation at a German cultural center in LA. I was approached by one of Barack Obama's czars, her name is Lorna Johnson. She proclaims to be of Jamaican ancestry. How much, I don't know, but she was put in charge of a czar of Caribbean and Jamaican, I think, general Caribbean culture and arts. And she said to me that there are a lot of things in my documentary need to change before there'll be any support. And I said, such as, and she said, for one thing, showing all those dilapidated places and houses, that if I was creating some myth that Jamaica has all this poverty, I said, who the hell do you think you are? You're put in charge as a czar under the president of the United States and you're oblivious to the type of poverty that exists in Jamaica. So there's like this, I'm not Robin Leach. I'm not here to do lifestyles of the rich and famous. I'm showing the reality as I saw it. Jamaica has a lot of poverty, and especially, go to Western Kingston and spend 10 minutes there. I dare you, if you're not from there, and you tell me that there's not poverty in Jamaica and there's not problems in Jamaica that need to be rectified and remedied. There's a lot of people with agenda. They did not want me discussing the poverty that's in Jamaica. And they also felt that, I portrayed these people, and it was not a portrayal. I mean, was it a portrayal? We go by definition. I simply pulled my camera out and shot what I saw. I spoke to people, and the answers, I posed questions, I got answers. It's that simple. If you don't like them, I'm not going to go and edit them out to appease your agendas and your economic or political agenda. She said that I showed them as downtrodden. And as we know, white people in Jamaica are not downtrodden. I said, they're Jamaicans. Well, it's not a documentary about white people. It's a documentary about Jamaicans. And yes, they felt they had a lot of difficulties in life. And they have the same challenges, I think, that any rural farming community in Jamaica faces. And that's a lot of lack of resources, a lack of clean water, a lack of medical care, proper dental and medical care, a lack of a lot of things, a lack of money. And if you're going to sit there and diminish their experience because their skin color, then, and I didn't have anything nice to say to this woman. I didn't want to build a bridge with her. If I even could have one, I certainly would have burned it immediately. And I did. It was a contentious situation, but this is where I run into. People don't want me exposing these things because the question is raises, what's being done? Yes. What's being done to help the education, the Seaford Town? Why? I always ask the question, why isn't it a major tourist destination? Now, there are individuals who have some excursions from Montego Bay and Negril, which is great, but why isn't it having lots and lots of German tourists and people from all over the world coming to visit it? One of the main things is it doesn't have a lot of resources. There's no bathrooms for people to be using. At least when I was there, I think they put some porta potties in at some point. Who's cleaning them? I don't know. I couldn't tell you. It's not a real tourist destination because it doesn't have resources for tourists. But why aren't people going there? Why isn't there influx of wealth? Why aren't there businesses, jobs, all those things? There's a lot of questions to be raised. And there's a lot of people that should take responsibility for it. But first and foremost, I think things are in our own hands. We don't look to a government to save you. Look to yourself.
Exactly. No, I couldn't agree with you more. And as you said, the narrative or the story that's being told of, for where tourists are going is beach and sand. It's not to these places, unfortunately. So going back to your documentary, what type of research, went into this, were you going to the archives or church records, or mostly just relying on the oral history?
I mean, I definitely went to Ricardo Arrizio's book, Lost White Tribes. I looked to Dr. Rebecca Tortello's documents, the Jamaican National Heritage Trust, the Jamaican Gleaner, some publications, and so on and so forth. I did utilize those resources. I did find a lot of documents from Father Francis that were circulating in the village, some Xeroxes and so on, and then just the oral history and stories of people in the village, whatever I could find and put together. Yeah. Okay. My producer, Clinton H. Wallace, is of the German Eldermeyer family lineage, and he was a big part of putting together our script, our narration with me. So.
Mm-hmm. And so, David, were there anything that surprised you during filming about or researching about Germantown at all?
I've lived a lot of the experience. So a lot of it was kind of things that I've already seen throughout Jamaica and Haiti. So I wasn't surprised or gobsmacked or something, out of left field. But I think the reaction of so much of the audience that I've dealt with as I did screening tours internationally and Q&A sessions at the end of all my events, people's visceral reactions they would have and how they would internalize it, and they would have rage against the residents of Seaford Town or the documentary itself or towards me and go up in arms and say, this is a lie, this is a fabrication. And they would say things like, Jamaica has no concept of race and racialism, et cetera, et cetera. That same person would be supporting, if you went to their Facebook page, would have quotes from Black nationalists like Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey. And I'm like, well, are you just trying to gaslight at me and everyone? Is this just pulling one over on me? Or what's this cognitive dissonance I always deal with? It's this, it'd be funny. It's like, I remember someone who was trashing my film, but on their social media, because they said it's racialized, et cetera, et cetera. And Jamaica has no concept of race. That same person had a quote from Muhammad Ali. He was in an interview talking about how Black people shouldn't mix. But the woman that you saw, Amy Brown, she was demonized, and she's, and people will trash her. If you're going to attack an elderly centurion, a woman who's near 100 years old, why don't you stand up to Louis Farrakhan every time he comes into Jamaica promoting racialism and racial separation? You don't have an issue with him, but you have an issue with me. That's absurd. What sounds like to me is you're a coward. You look for low-hanging fruit to kick around, and you actually don't care about racial separation or racialism. Maybe you just don't like white people. How's that for a suggestion? That's what I had to deal with in a lot of my lectures and types of mindsets. And it's this double think. Jamaica has no concept of race, but the same person would then bring up, White people have white privilege in Jamaica. How are they poor? That's ridiculous. You just told me there's no concept of race. Which one is it? Is this like a little magic trick? White people exist when it's convenient, and then they don't exist when it's convenient. Which one is it here?
Mm-hmm. And so, how does, Germantown fit into the larger story of course, migration and multiculturalism in Jamaica?
I think it's a part of the fabric of Jamaican culture and history, a very small piece of it, perhaps, but it's definitely a piece of it. And I think, uh, Jamaican culture is a Creole culture. It's mixed up. It's a culture that's been blended of numerous different cultures. One could argue that's any nation or culture, unless you're in a small, tribal, secluded society. All cultures have happened through some level of intermingling. And Jamaica is a very recent result of that, which we saw happen very rapidly and dramatically over a short period of time in the context of history. And German aspects of culture are there. They're there. They're living on. They're not as prominent, say, as maybe British or as African or Irish in the Celtic aspects, but they're definitely there. And in the case of Seaford Town, they're most certainly there. That's where you find, I think it's highlighted. And I just think that if you respect Indian heritage as it plays in the Jamaica, Chinese, British, European, of any kind, African, this is a piece of it. It's a part of that puzzle. It's a part of that tapestry. And I think it should be cherished, as small as it might be,
Yeah,
at least noticed and given a little recognition.
absolutely, absolutely. And David, and why is it important for Jamaica and the world to know about communities like this?
I think we can learn a lot from a microcosm.
Mm-hmm.
We look at things on a macro level and they get very, very complex. And I know that a tiny village versus the politics and issues of the entire world, it's apples and oranges. But maybe if we examine these microcosms, we can see other aspects of our own lives and the world we live in and try to evaluate it. We can pull something from it. I think Seaford Town is an interesting thing that throws a monkey wrench in some people's political worldviews and agendas, perhaps, and that's why they're hostile to it. It takes these oversimplified versions of history and these oversimplified versions of politics and whatever people are subscribing to, and you see this, and this makes things a little more difficult. This has a different dichotomy to it, and I think the narrative of European descended people in Jamaica all being the Bush or Bakra Massa is an oversimplified version.
Yes.
And I think there's people who subscribe to that around the world. They just see it as the groups of haves and have-nots. And it's much more complex than that. When we talk about, say, we use the word white people or European descended people in Jamaica, they come from many different stripes and ilks. Same with people of any given ethnic and racial heritage. It's very complex, and I think it's brings more complexity to the world we live in. In the case of Jamaica, and this can translate out, you can translate this into any different society. There's a lot to say about assimilation, how you need to be a part of the society you're around. I think that, and it also says a lot to say about, at the same time, the importance of your cultural retention and heritage, and what should you hold on to, what shouldn't you hold on to, and how to do it. And I think there's a lot you can learn from Seaford Town. I think it still makes me ponder about these things to this very day. And I think it's taught me some things. I hope it teaches people, other people who watch it, the same.
No, definitely. And, as we come to a close, what would you say that you hope that audience take away from watching this documentary?
A sense of empathy, a sense of sympathy. I think seeing the struggles immigrants go through, migrants go through, at the same time recognizing the importance of assimilation and being a part of your society that you're in. But having a sense of empathy for them. We talk about difficult things in that documentary, but rather than just
Yeah.
showing disgust and disdain or contempt or judgment, why don't you understand the things those people have gone through and where they've come from and where they are now, rather than pointing a finger and judging? I've had people say, why are they poor? They live on farms. Have you ever farmed? Do you know the struggles of being a farmer? I remember someone saying, oh, how did the first arrivals starve? Jamaica is flourishing with food. Now that you've had generations of agriculture and people cultivating the land, how arrogant, you think that it was like that in the 19th century when someone was in a swamp. Please, with not to mention people who did not have resistance to malaria and dengue and all these things. People dying in mass numbers, the emotional toll that takes on you when you watch all of your children and your whole family die and you might be the last one. And a lot of documentation that there were people hanging themselves in that village during that time period. Had a big suicide rate. They felt despair and no way out. So I think that's these are things that people should take into context, and a sense of empathy, sympathy. I think that would be a good thing to take away from it.
Yeah, no, definitely. No, thank you so much. I definitely appreciate your time for coming on to the podcast and discussing this. I think we could have gone on for a little bit longer, but no, I just want to thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Hey, Wendy, thank you very much for having me, and I appreciate it. If anyone wants to come to my channel, I have all my films on YouTube. If you could direct them, I would appreciate it greatly, and thank you for everything.
Absolutely, I will. I'll definitely put that in the show notes. Thank you. Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.